The most common traditional reading of Scripture is that Adam and Eve were specially and directly created about 6,000 years ago and were the first two humans. But there is extremely strong scientific evidence against that set of claims. And so we have a problem. Does the Bible definitively teach that Adam and Eve existed instead of being merely literary figures? If so, when could they have lived? These are really big and important questions, and it takes courage to tackle them as they are controversial. And so I commend Dr. William Lane Craig for his new book, In Quest of the Historical Adam. Dr. Craig has a hypothesis that may solve the Adam and Eve problem. What is the hypothesis and is it viable? Let's take a look. Hey there, I'm John and welcome to my channel. We believe that you can be a faithful follower of Jesus and also embrace modern science. So, what's the hypothesis? Dr. Craig proposes that Adam was a historical person who lived about 750,000 years ago. Regarding the historical person part, due to the mythological aspects of early Genesis, Dr. Craig narrows the genre of early Genesis down to ancient mythology, which conveys deep truths in a figurative way but does not necessarily involve historical characters, and mytho-history, which also relies on figurative language but speaks of real people. He concludes that the genre of early Genesis is mytho-history, and thus Adam is real. This conclusion rests largely on two things. One is the genealogies included in early Genesis. He argues they must refer to real people because the early Genesis genealogies are stitched together into the later genealogies which concern historical people such as Abraham. Second, his interpretation of New Testament scripture, but largely one passage, a very difficult one to interpret, Romans 5, 12 to 21, convinces him that Adam must be historical. Now, while I think that early Genesis could be mytho-history rather than ancient mythology, I'm not as convinced as is Dr. Craig. I don't think that the early Genesis genealogies being attached to the later ones necessitates that the former were concerned with history. For example, the attachment point comes at a place in Scripture where the genre suddenly shifts. Moreover, I think that a key to understanding the intentions and purposes of the early Genesis genealogies is to view them as being in conversation with, as a response to, perhaps as a polemic against, the Sumerian king list and other Mesopotamian texts. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Amar Anus. I'd love to see Dr. Craig interact with that scholarship. As for Romans 5, it is a very difficult passage, especially in light of evolution, and I'm wrestling with it myself. It's a challenge, and I don't have it all figured out. I can see how it points many people to a literal Adam. On the whole, though, my current thought is that when Dr. Craig concludes that biblically faithful Christians are obligated to affirm the historicity of Adam and Eve, I think he is overreaching. Now, next, Dr. Craig turns to the dating. When did Adam live? He takes the view, and this is critical, that the image of God refers, at least in large part, to things like intelligence and symbolic thinking and so forth. Now, this is a debatable point. Anyway, his assumption is important because it leads him to conclude that Neanderthals were also made in the image of God. Thus, Adam and Eve must have lived before the last common ancestor of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. So now we're talking like 750,000 years ago. So how did this work? Well, to quote Dr. Craig, we may envision, along with Kenneth Kemp, an initial population of, say, 5,000 hominins, animals that are in many respects like human beings, but that lack the capacity for rational thought. Out of this population, God selects two and furnishes them with intellects by renovating their brains and endowing them with rational souls. Only they are therefore truly human. Importantly, these improvements that God bestows upon Adam and Eve are heritable, and everyone alive today is descended from them. Could this actually work scientifically? As best I understand, it could. But for me personally, it isn't super compelling. For one thing, I don't think a scientist would look at the evidence and say, hey, I think it is a promising hypothesis that there was a genetic bottleneck of two people 750,000 years ago. Dr. Craig responds by arguing there is no evidence, one way or another. He argues that while such a bottleneck hasn't happened in the last 500,000 years, we don't have the required information to rule out it having happened before that. Well, I'm interested in hearing what scientists will have to say about this topic. Plus, we have the issue of the genealogies referring to a literal Adam that lived so long ago. Are we to think the genealogies refer to real people and yet stretch out well over 500,000 years? Well, they could, in principle. However, there are other objections from the area of archaeology and other places that may be harder to deal with. Recall the importance Dr. Craig places upon Adam having the image of God, and how for Dr. Craig that means human traits like rationality and, I presume, spirituality and symbolic thought. There is currently no evidence that hominins had, 750,000 years ago, the attributes that Dr. Craig calls the hallmarks of the image of God. For example, as Dr. Craig himself details in the book, the oldest evidence of advanced tools and burials and artwork do not go back anywhere near that far. And I'll add that advanced language probably did not go back nearly that far either. So to emphasize, this is a courageous contribution to a vital discussion. I expect Dr. Craig will encounter wide disagreement, but iron sharpens iron. Let the conversation continue.